American history story time. After Al Capone's residency, but before Sean Connery's visit, Native Americans occupied the Rock. And I don't mean Dwayne, I'm talking about the infamous island in San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz. Europeans first found San Francisco Bay and its famous windswept island in 1542. But Native Americans had been inhabiting the area and making use of the island for 10 to 20,000 years before that. And in true European fashion, we're like, hey, that little island and this whole bay area is kind of cool, so it's mine now. Then in the 1800s, they found out that there was gold in them there hills, and a gold rush ensued, causing a huge boom in the San Francisco area. And as a result, we're like, oh yeah, San Francisco looks like it's kind of getting to be a big deal, so maybe we should do something to defend it. But how? Well, if you've ever walked the Golden Gate Bridge and gazed out into the bay, you'll notice that every boat that comes and goes has to pass by Alcatraz, which made it a logical place to stick guns to shoot at unwanted boats. So we got a bunch of pillows and blankets and we built a fort that for nearly 60 years would be the most powerful fort west of the Mississippi. We quickly realized that in addition to fending off unwanted floaters, it was also a good place to stash people we didn't want wandering around. By 1859, the barracks were already being used to incarcerate military prisoners. Then as the Civil War began to rage on, we quickly found that a little island on the west coast was a great place to store some Confederate trader tots, because it was highly unlikely that the Al-Qaeda forces of the Confederacy were going to liberate Alcatraz, and even if they did escape, they'd have to get all the way back across the country to be reunited with their treason tribe. After the war, the US really started focusing on westward expansion, which meant fucking over a lot more natives, so Alcatraz started housing many of the ones that we weren't happy with. Then the Spanish-American War kicks off, and we send a bunch of boys to the Philippines, where they come back with all kinds of fun new diseases. By this point, every hospital in San Francisco, including the one on Alcatraz, was overwhelmed with sick patients. And we were also bringing back a lot of prisoners, mostly soldiers who did things they weren't supposed to. In 1899, there was 25 prisoners on Alcatraz, and in 1900, there was 441. Talk about a population boom. So with prisoners, military personnel, and staff, there was easily around 500 people on the Rock at the turn of the century, and if you've ever visited the island, it's not a very big rock. That had to be some cramped conditions. Now, by the turn of the century, we'd managed to build ourselves a pretty big navy, and we had airplanes, and our old-fashioned forts were falling out of fashion in favor of our newfangled mechanized militaries. By 1907, it had been dedicated pretty much just as a military prison, but it was a minimum security military facility, and maintaining it as such began to prove impractical. Turns out getting food, water, and supplies to an island that doesn't sit in exactly serene, peaceful waters is kind of expensive. Then the Great Depression hits, and everybody's broke, and they're like, why the hell are we paying for this shit? And so the Army's like, okay, deuces, and they left. But then the Federal Bureau of Prisons took note, and they're like, hey, it's the 1930s, and we outlawed alcohol for some stupid reason, so we've got all these notorious gangsters now doing notorious crimes. Maybe we should have a notorious place to put them. So they took control of Alcatraz, upgraded it to a maximum security prison, and started putting the Al Capones of the world there. And they're like, this is perfect, because no one could possibly escape from this island. But like unsinkable ships that are now helping us rid the world of rich people, there's no such thing as an inescapable prison. Although of the 36 people who attempted escaping Alcatraz, only 3 were successful, so the odds were pretty much in the penitentiary's favor. For the next 3 decades, Alcatraz operated as a federal penitentiary, but as the 1960s approached, the buildings were getting a little worse for wear and needed some major updates, and the government also realized that it was costing them over 3 times as much money to house prisoners on the Rock as it did in your average prison. So by 1963, it was no longer a penitentiary. But this was the 1960s, a time of civil disobedience and civil rights fights. And now there's this newly unattended island that was ripe for Richards to take their stand. And I mean that literally, not as a euphemism. In 1964, 5 natives, led by a man named Richard Mackenzie, occupied the island for 4 hours. During the occupation, they made the demands that the island be given to the natives to be used as a university and cultural center. And this was significant because those demands would be echoed almost verbatim 5 years later when a Native American group occupied the island again, led by a man named Richard Oakes. See, I told you, Richards had a hard-on for the Rock. And this occupation was more significant because it lasted 19 months, ending in 1971. And after the government failed to get them to leave in the first few months, they started negotiating with Alcatraz's new occupants. Negotiating is kind of a strong word, I guess. The natives were like, give us complete ownership of the island and let us build a university, cultural center, and museum here. And the US government was like, yeah, how about no? Eventually, the government did offer the natives a portion of Fort Miley in San Francisco as an alternative to Alcatraz, but at this point, the natives were willing to settle for nothing less than 100% of their original demands being met. And the government was like, okay, good luck with that. And they shut off the power and stopped offering water barge services and said, I guess you'll figure it out on your own then. By this point, organization amongst the occupiers started to fall apart. While the original occupiers were mostly well-organized students from UCLA, new people started showing up to the occupation that were more part of the hippie street culture, if you will. Open-air there, drug and alcohol use became more prevalent. There was some reports of violence. And then tragically, Richard Oakes' daughter fell 3 stories to her death while on the island, spurring him to give up the cause and go home. This left a leadership vacuum that led to infighting, and all sense of organization kind of fell apart. A series of events and bad press started turning public favor against them, and on June 10th, 1971, Richard Nixon ordered the remaining occupiers be forcibly removed, which was done without incident. And while none of their demands were met, it could still be billed as a success, because with the newfound publicity, the Bureau of Indian Affairs finally decided to hire some Indians to work for them, and Richard Nixon returned Blue Lake and 48,000 acres of land to the Tau tribe. And Alcatraz today stands as a museum that not only honors the history of the prison and the fort, but also its Native American history, including its 19-month occupation. In fact, that's how I know about it, because when we were in San Francisco, Emily and I toured Alcatraz, and their occupation is a centerpiece of the museum. From the moment you step off the boat, throughout the entire tour, you see remnants of the occupation, and they teach you about it. And if you are ever in San Francisco, I highly recommend doing the tour. Make sure you book your reservation ahead of time because they have limited availability, and it's not the cheapest tour in the world, but it is well worth it. One of the coolest things to do in San Francisco, and that's saying something. Also, we were there in the middle of summer, and it was flippin' freezing, so make sure you plan accordingly. But that's the cool history of how, well, most inhabitants of Alcatraz throughout history were trying to dream up ways to escape. One group of brave indigenous people found a way to stay far longer than anyone dreamt possible. And while their occupation did end with some tragedy and didn't have the success they'd hoped, their sacrifice led to a huge step forward in Native American relations with a country that has criminally mistreated its indigenous population since its inception.